Hi, BookTube, and welcome to a new video. I'm going to talk about a couple of books. Jenny McCartney's The Ghost Factory, set in Northern Ireland, just after the peace agreement has brought peace and a sort of permanent ceasefire to Northern Ireland, which is exactly the same time as my own novel is set. And The Feral Detective by Jonathan Lethem. Apologies for the plain cover, but this book is only out in hardback in the UK, and it's £18 for a 300-page book. Strikes me as hideously expensive, so I went down the cheap marketplace route, and I can't remember exactly how much I paid, but it was about a third of that. And I'm going to start with The Feral Detective because I'm a big Lethem fan. He is a New York author, and his books that sort of established him, like Motherless Brooklyn and Chronic City, are both very much New York books. But here he turns his attention to the West Coast. This is set in California. And it's not the California of, digital tech. It's not the California of Hollywood. It's the California of the Mojave Desert and alternative communities, alternative lifestyles. But he's sort of channeling the spirit of Charles Manson in the communities that he sort of sets up in this book. It's also set against the background of 5 days until Trump's inauguration. And Phoebe, who's a 40-something unmarried woman in New York, just can't bear the thought of Trump and everything he stands for, and has to get out of New York. And a friend of hers who lives in I can't remember where, but not in New York, her daughter has gone missing. So Phoebe dedicates herself to tracking down this missing daughter and reuniting her with the mother. So that is how the book starts. And the Trump stuff is never overt. It's not like Kobet, where it's sort of, slapped in your face with like a wet fish repeatedly. But it is a very important context for Phoebe's character. And before I get into the meat of the book, I've seen reviews for this where it says, it's a mess, it's ill-disciplined, it's all over the place. Its gender politics are deeply flawed because ultimately, Phoebe, the main character, comes to rely on a hunky male to, bail her out of trouble. And I disagree with all of that for reasons which I clearly... I really enjoyed this. I am a fan, it's true. I haven't read a bad Lethem book ever. But he does have his own... he's not telling a story in a straight way, or he's not telling a straight story. They are slightly quirky. Anyway, so Phoebe basically is put in touch with this guy called Charles Heist, as in the word heist, as in bank robbery or whatever, who is the feral detective of the title. But interestingly, he appears in the book far less than Phoebe. Phoebe is the main character. It is Phoebe's voice, narrative voice, that we follow. And it turns out that he's feral, a feral detective, because he basically grew up in an alternative community out in the Mojave Desert. And it's a really interesting point that, this is a book about sort of the children of 60s hippies, the people who went out and started those communities. They went back to the earth, they shunned technology, they shunned all the things of modern life. But they're not feral, they just live in a sort of primitive, non-tech way. But they're children who are born and brought up in that world. They, as Charles Heist was, they are much more legitimately feral because they've never been exposed as children to all these gadgets and stuff, which I think is a really interesting point that Lethem makes there. And basically Heist and Phoebe together, try and get on the trail of this missing girl. And Phoebe is very garrulous, very talkative. She's New York. She's sort of trying to wisecrack. She's trying to break Heist open because he's, very self-contained, doesn't give much away. Plus she has a bit of a crush on him. So they're very much sort of chalk and cheese characters. And I think Lethem's early books, like Motherless Brooklyn, like Chronic City, are books about men. The narrative voices are male. The Blot, which is previous to this, and this, the female voices are brilliantly realised. Now, The Blot, the female voices were not the main characters, but they were much more interested in the main characters. Here, the main character is Phoebe, is a female voice. And I think Lethem writes really interesting women. She's got all this sort of, anti-Trump stuff, sort of implied Me Too sort of sensibilities, but she's much more broad, much more subtly drawn than that. She is a person with real feelings, the lust and the yearning for Heist against certain things of the repulsion of what what his background is and where he comes from. That's always that sort of interplay, and I think this is a rich three-dimensional character portrayal here, and she discovers the feral side of herself, and that I think that's what makes this book really interesting. That when push comes to shove, when your back's against the wall or whatever, we are animals. Human beings are animals, fight or flight, and all that sort of stuff. And in a way, she's more feral. The feral detective, Charles Heist, may have had a feral upbringing, but now he's fairly well centred, he's fairly well zen, whereas she discovers the feral side in her, but it sits quite comfortably with the New York, wisecracking, quite cultured, sort of the counterculture side. They both exist in her. Again, that's why I say she's quite a rich character. And I'm not going to spoil the plot or anything, but basically, there's two tribes in the Mojave Desert that the action centres around. There's a tribe of basically women called the Rabbits, and then there's a tribe of sort of men who are called the Bears. And they're very sort of testosterone, tattoos, ex-bikers, a lot of them. And there's a sort of low-level intensity war between them. They were originally sort of one community, but they split along gender lines. And therefore it is a sort of prolonged metaphor about gender relations, in a Trump America, and also before a Trump America, because obviously these communities have existed in the 60s. And anyone who was there, and I wasn't there, will tell you in the 60s that the role of women, even in hippie communities, was still, they were very much, just objects to be used by the men, chicks and all that sort of stuff. So, this goes back to the 60s, and of course the whole Me Too thing goes really back to sort of Buster Keaton in the 20s, So these two tribes are sort of at low-level war, and Heist can straddle both of them because he was brought up in those communities before they split. And so he can go among them. And sort of Phoebe sort of insists on sort of, bolting onto him so that she gets exposed to these communities as well. And, there's lots of there's lots of ritual, faux ritual in my opinion. But anyway, I think that's, again, a point that Lethem's making. And it all builds up into a crescendo where Phoebe discovers her feral side. And, I think it's well written. I think there's a lot to ponder on. I think the characterisation is great. There are echoes. I wouldn't put it any more strongly. There are echoes of the politics of Trump America. It is not done face on, head on like Kobek, as I say. It's in there. It's context. It's background. It's what Phoebe is running away from into a sort of primitivism that Trump's supporters stand for. They're not hippies and dropouts, but they exhibit the same primitivism as in the Virginia riots, where they all sort of turn up. They've got all these shields and they're all in uniform and stuff. It's the same mentality, the same primitivism as exhibited by these sort of two quite cultish in a way. Alternative communities in the desert. So I thought this was a terrific read. As I say, it's not a book that you can go and sort of take wider, this stands for this represents that. It's in there, but it's fictionalised enough, and it's a work of imagination enough because it doesn't really exist, that you can't say, oh yeah, that directly translates to that, because there's a lot of, I suppose, poetic license. Lethem creates an imaginative tale which has resonances. And I just think it's a supreme work. That's what Lethem does. And those criticisms of him being all over the place and sloppy and ill-disciplined in this, I don't accept at all. I'm not saying that. Chronic City is a stoner novel, and there are elements of that throughout all of his style, but that doesn't make it ill-disciplined. It's not tight because the plot is sort of quite free-ranging and freewheeling. But I loved it, 5 stars. And on to this book, The Ghost Factory by Jenny McCartney. Now, as I say, it's set in Northern Ireland, straight after the peace agreement, as is mine. This is set in the Protestant community, the Protestant loyalist community, as is mine. Whereas Milkman by Anna Burns looks back on the troubles from the 70s and 80s, before the peace agreement in 1999, and is set in the Catholic community. And I say that because the reason I read this is because I love Milkman. It's my number 2 book from last year, number 2 read. And I wanted to see one from the Protestant side. As I say, although they're slightly set at different times. And there are resonances in this book. I think there's quite a lot of books being published about that period in Northern Irish history by Northern Ireland writers, because of Anna Burns winning, the Booker Prize. People have suddenly got interested in fiction. I think the fiction's always been being written by Irish writers, Northern Irish writers, but now publishers are sitting up and taking notice because of Anna Burns. So this starts off really well, in that it starts off with an explanation of people's names, as does mine, funnily enough. But it's not the name so much, it's the epithets attached to them. So you're either wee or big. So Big Jackie or Wee Jackie. That can either be in stature or more likely the relationship. And here Big Jackie is the dad, Wee Jackie is the son, even though he's quite a hulking man himself. And there's a character called Titch, which for Americans who don't know, well, they may not know, that's sort of slang for somebody who's small, titchy. And he's simple-minded. He's a sort of gentle giant, but he is simple-minded. And the book starts off, he makes a mistake through his simple-mindedness, whereby he steals some biscuits from a shop, which happens to be run by one of the bigwigs in the loyalist paramilitary movement, and he receives what's called a punishment beating to teach him a lesson. Now, a punishment beating is basically what it sounds like, and there's a brilliant scene in here where another character suffers a punishment beating and ends up in hospital, and in the bed next to him is someone who suffered a punishment beating, but they've suffered it at the hands of their own side. So the main guy, he suffered it from the Protestants, just like Titch had, but the guy in the bed next to him suffered it from the provisional IRA, the Republican side, because basically these guys are gangsters. It's dressed up with sort of political dressing, but they are basically gangsters. And when they say, oh, we're protecting our community from joyriders and thieves and all this, that and the other, what they actually mean is it's a way for them to retain control over their community, so they get all the ill-gotten gains of the drug trade and other sort of illicit practices. So that was a really good scene where you got these two guys lying next to each other in hospital, both having suffered the same sort of punishment beatings, but from their own sides, and those sides, they're comparing and contrasting notes. So it starts off really well, this. And then it becomes a tale of vengeance and a tale of somebody wanting to disappear. So, so somebody leaves Belfast to escape the threat that's looming over them. And they go to London and they sort of want to become invisible. But you still, as a human being, you still want to have a life, maybe have a partner, start a family and all that. So it's that tension between wanting to be invisible and disappear versus actually wanting to have a life, wanting to exist. And that gets you to about halfway point, 2/3 point, and then there's this sort of, vengeance storyline. But it's not plain and simple vengeance, because the man who wants vengeance, he does not have the heart of these paramilitaries. He's not a warrior like them. He has to find a way of gaining vengeance when he can't pull the trigger, or he can't take a baseball bat to hit the person that he's targeted. So all of that is fine. But after the vengeance storyline, the book goes on to no purpose at all. It's sort of an aftermath where I just didn't see what it added. But that's not the real problem of the book. The tale the book tells is good, and I would have given it sort of 3.5 to 4 stars. But the problem is the writing. Even though it started off really well, by about halfway through I realised a trend that began really to sort of get on my nerves. And by way of sort of introduction to that, I'm just going to read you the biography of the author. This is her first novel. Jenny McCartney grew up in Northern Ireland and lives in London, where she works as a journalist. Now, I don't think journalists write very good fiction. And I say that because journalists that writing, for newspapers is a different discipline to writing, imaginatively and creatively. First of all, you're restricted by word limits or column size, which is a completely arbitrary and artificial way of sort of having your writing shaped. They are trained, quite rightly, to sort of be as objective as they can, and yet the profession of journalism seems to have a very sort of loose set of standards as to, well, this is true by journalism standards, and yet it seems to allow a lot of slack as to stuff being published that isn't backed up properly by research. But the biggest thing I find with journalists is that they might be good metaphors in their journalistic writing, but in fiction they're really lumpy and leaden, and I'm going to give several examples of that in here. Now, the obvious sort of counter to what I'm saying is, George Orwell was a journalist, which absolutely he was. But I would offer you that George Orwell had a great imagination, the allegory of Animal Farm, his imagination of where totalitarianism would lead in 1984. Fantastic feats of the imagination. But the writing is very simple and very stripped back and laid bare. That's why we have the Orwell Prize, that sort of acknowledges sort of that sort of kind of simple writing. There's nothing wrong with simple writing, but then you have to have something else. For me, you have to have something else that makes it literary if the language isn't. I don't particularly like books that are simple language if they're not doing anything else stylistically. So on to the examples. There's some really horrible metaphors and similes that just wore me down in this book, really, and I would knock a whole star off for them. Okay, so here's the first one. Fate had handed other people all the benefits that came from a real live mother and coolly denied them to me because his mother was died. Like some hard-faced cloakroom attendant who lost my only coat on a freezing night and never said sorry. So she's comparing the death of a mother with a truculent cloakroom assistant. I mean, that's not a simile. That collapses under its own asymmetry of weight between the two things. You could say it the other way, handing me my coat with the expression as if her mother had just died. Yeah, that makes sense, but the other way doesn't make any sense. So this is during the vengeance scene when it wasn't a good position to be in, threatening a fella like McGee with a fake gun. It was like going to a showdown during the Cold War with an Airfix model of a nuclear bomb. So Airfix is a sort of a make of model aeroplanes and tanks. Used to glue the kits together and paint them and put the stickers on. So going into against a hardened paramilitary with a fake gun, she describes as like going into a showdown during the Cold War with an Airfix model of a nuclear bomb. So first of all, Airfix didn't make models of nuclear bombs, but we couldn't allow that maybe. So it's sort of two war metaphors. Going in with a fake gun is the actuality, being compared to a fake nuclear bomb or a plastic nuclear bomb. Again, it can't bear the weight. And then finally, oh no, not finally, I think I've got two more. People over in England ask me sometimes eagerly, what do you think of Northern Ireland now? What do you think of the peace? I say, it is what it is. And their faces fall a little, as if they had handed me an expensive birthday present and I had said sulkily, I would have liked it better in red. Now that's exactly what I mean by prosaic metaphor. There's no imagination in that. He's given a non-committal answer to the question, what do you think of Northern Ireland now? That's fine. But it's then, given the simile, as if they had handed me an expensive birthday present and I had said sulkily, I would have liked it better in red. I mean, that's just poor, really. I'm sorry, I just can't think of any worse way of expressing something. And finally, oh yeah, this isn't a metaphor. This is really interesting because this is page 289, so 7 pages before the end of the book, okay? And it's not a spoiler. Nonetheless, it was occupied. The young lads were building a bonfire there for the 12th of July celebrations to commemorate when the Protestant forces of King William of Orange routed the Catholic ones of King James in 1690. In our streets, news from the 17th century was still hot stuff. Now, that is a bit of sort of info dump for people who don't know, you know, what the history of Northern Ireland's divisions are, why these bonfires and marches happen. And that's fine, you know, to take a decision to explain all that for people who might not be sort of cognisant of what it is. But to do it 7 pages from the end suggests to me that you've introduced this right at the end of the book, when really it should have been done much, much earlier, and it would have been justified to explain it. But if this is the first time you feel the need to explain what the historical context is 7 pages from the end, it's in the wrong place. It shouldn't be there. And just as a mitigation, because, you know, there are one or two, as I say, the beginning I thought was really strong. There are sort of one or two nice bits of writing. So as part of the vengeance storyline, he drugs the paramilitaries' dog. I didn't like to see the dog there in the rain getting cold. I wanted to put a blanket over him, but I couldn't let go of McGee. It would be a fatal sign of soft-heartedness. The whole thing was losing momentum anyway. There was too much chat. The action was starting to sag. Any minute now, we'd be sitting around a circle crying and discussing what went wrong with our childhoods. And I really like that, because here's a guy pretending that he's going to, you know, inflict violence, if not even kill, a hardened paramilitary, a hardened sort of soldier of the streets. And she's used the metaphor, you know, as if we'd be sitting around, any minute now we'd be sitting around in a circle crying and discussing what went wrong in our childhoods. And I like that, because it's absurd, but there's absolute truth in it. You know, these men, and they are men, of violence, are pretty much like that because of their upbringings, particularly their absent fathers, many of whom were killed or were in jail for their paramilitary activities. That's how the torch gets passed down. And my book deals entirely with the legacy of, before you're born, your political and religious allegiance is established for you, you know, by accident of birth. So you know, she can do it. But I just felt overall in this book there are too many metaphors, and a lot of them are throwaway and disposable and not really enlightening. The whole point of a metaphor is to compare one thing in terms of another, to expand, to extend the reverberations of the original thing that you're comparing it to. And she uses so many in here, and so many are sort of fairly flat and leaden, that in the end it has the opposite effect. So I was a bit disappointed in this, to be honest. I would give it, as I say, I'd probably end up giving it 3, and it could easily be 3.5 or 4, but her writing style, and as I say, I put that down to her being a journalist. I don't know what she's a journalist of, I don't know what her specialism is. I think, unfortunately, lets it down. So there you have it. That's The Ghost Factory by Jenny McCartney, and the wonderful The Feral Detective by Jonathan Lethem. So, till next time, thanks very much.